Welcome to Amani Africa's podcast, The Pan-Africanist. This is our podcast that covers multilateral issues of concern and interest for Africa. And we are at a time when the world is experiencing profound change. The shocks in the global arena gets to be felt very strongly in our part of the world. And those developments are therefore of immediate and direct policy concern for policymakers here on the African continent, not least of all, the African Union. Today, I am joined by Professor Achim of the Geneva Graduate Institute. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Achim. And let's start with you, please telling to our audience who you are and why you are here in Addis.
Thank you very much, Solomon, and thank you to Amani Africa to have me on your program. I'm a professor at the Geneva Graduate Institute, and my specialization is on peace mediation, a very important diplomatic hub for the management and the resolution of conflict. And also, of course, the multilateral dimension is particularly important on this, as the African Union and other international organizations that are based here in Addis play such an important role in this respect.
Now, let's start our conversation with where the multilateral system or the global order stands today. The global order is in a very bad place, really, really bad place. In 2022, in the UN Security Council, we heard what the state of the global order was. You know, it was described as being on its deathbed. And if it was on that condition in February 2022, and it's difficult to imagine if it is still surviving today, given the scale and magnitude of what we have experienced since then. So it would be great to have your reflections, wearing your hat both as somebody who also operates in a very important multilateral hub in Geneva, but also as a professor of peace mediation.
Thank you. So what we see from Geneva, and we of course equally concerned about the state of the world, is that global order is contested and it's changing day by day. So what we see in the media, what we experience also in our daily interactions on multilateralism in Geneva, is that we no longer have the multilateralism that many of those who have worked in the UN, in other international organizations over the last 30 years know. So we have arrived in a new world. And it's no longer an emerging new order, it is a new order. And what this new order represents is that many different countries become more autonomous in their projection of power and in their search for alliances for protection. That means, with respect to the international legal norms that frame the United Nations, that frame the type of order that has structured the last 30 years, that there are some countries that disregard this order because it is no longer congruent with the power politics they wish to operate. There is a group of countries that want to kind of pull back those countries who believe in power-based strategies in order to prevent the worst, which is, of course, the application of even more dangerous weapons that affect even more people and more civilians.
So you touched on a number of issues. You touched on the fact that, you know, the geopolitical and power arrangement or situation is no longer congruent with the interests of some countries, and therefore those countries are basically disregarding. The other thing that you said is basically we are not even in a moment of transition from the pre-existing order to a new order. You said that we are already in the new order. If the trends that we have witnessed over the past, this is going to be, I think, a defining decade by all, standards. If you think about it, the 2020s is going to be the defining decade in terms of the end of the old and, into the emergence of the new. But what are the outlines of this new order? What is it that it is based on? All right, because you said on the one hand that there is a new order. On the other hand, you said that there are many countries who actually are insisting on sticking to the old order. All right, but does the old order already still exist?
So we are living in a world that has a multitude of legal instruments that regulate the world. No? And as with national law, there might be rules that you should not cross the zebra crossing when the traffic light is red, but nevertheless, many people do it. So in the application of international law, there is always the ideal of the law, and then how it is, of course, implemented in different contexts by different actors. Now, what I think is important to emphasize is that when we see these significant breaches of international law, of the fundamental principles of the unviability of national sovereignty, particularly with respect to an unsanctioned war against other countries, be that Russia on Ukraine, be that Israel on Iran, be that, of course, major attacks of Hamas on Israel. These are breaches of international law, and they need to be managed with respect to the instruments of law that they are at their disposition. But because we are living in an international order where also power is a very important political instrument, there is this tension between the law and what it stands for, what it is, and the norms that it represents, and the application of power. And that is a tension that requires politics to be managed. So in effect, when you ask me about the ingredients of the current day and of the global order, it is again that we're going to an order where we need to relearn how to do politics, where we can, on the one hand, take the elements, the fundamental elements of the international law that we have at our disposition, of if you are a peace-loving nation or a peace-loving institution, in order to try to rein in those countries that are building their foreign policy on the unchecked execution of power. So, and that is politics.
But the current moment, including the unprecedented scale of breaches and disregard of fundamental principles of the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, is a manifestation of a deeper problem. Rather, on and of itself, it's a problem. But it is also a manifestation of a deeper problem. And that brings me to the question of how did we get here to this point? We got to this point, is it not because despite the perception that we have had during you made reference to the past 30 years, I understand that you are making reference to the post-Cold War moment, that unipolar moment, right? Isn't it the case that we got to this point because of how that order in the first place was organized or structured, that the flaws in that structure and in that design are now manifesting themselves? They have been manifesting themselves before, because history didn't start in 2022 or in 2023, all right? And these events actually come against the background of, many decades of how things have been organized.
A day after the 80th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter, it's of course important to recognize that the foundations of the order upon which particularly the UN system is based is a Westphalian system of states. And here, upon your question of how we got there, we got here by a very small number of countries agreeing to the Charter of the United Nations that was then projected on many of the other countries that would join the family of nations over these 80 years that the UN is in existence. Now, I think we see various tendencies that make, on the one hand, the UN Charter a fundamental basis of order, but also we see many transitions that show how that order defined by the UN Charter needs to be updated and reconsidered. On the one hand, there is, of course, that many countries that were not yet in existence did not have an appropriate voice necessarily in the designing of an international order, of which today they are a very important agent. And here, particularly, being in Addis, it's important to highlight the very strong, the very numerous African countries that are becoming ever more autonomous in the articulation of Africa's role in the world. This is, I think, one. But there are, of course, many other different sources of power beyond nation states. The power of large-scale corporations, particularly in the digital space, is completely out of reach of a lot of the current normative and legal framework that has come out of the United Nations system. It requires a different type of approach. Many of the innovations with respect to new weapon systems fall outside of the regulation of arms and disarmament procedures. So there are, with the evolution of the world, there are certain limitations that are inbuilt into the current system. What I like to say is that imagine you contracted an insurance policy in 1945 that would protect you and your country against the risk that existed in 1945. Now you cannot expect that same insurance policy protects you against all the risks that exist in 2025 for your country. So there is a certain need to organize complementary insurances through additional means as part of the existing system by reforming the system, or also simply by having the courage and say we need new institutions and new ways of working to protect countries, people, and also economic interests from the new challenges that are out there.
I think this point basically brings us, I think it's a very excellent example that you gave. You get insurance in respect of a defined risk, all right? When new risk emerge, you have basically to add additional insurance for that new risk, all right? I think this concerns new risks that emerge in the world over the course of the past decades. You mentioned artificial intelligence and digital, technology, new weapons system, and we can add to that pandemics in the context of COVID-19. Then you can add climate change. So the risks that humanity as a collective is confronted with have transformed. So there is a need for addressing that dimension of the equation. And from the perspective of the initial question that I asked, there is also the question of whether or not the insurance policy that was agreed to in 1945 have actually, in the first place, been substantively been applied evenly in respect of all countries and situations. In the first place, as you rightly mentioned, there were many countries that didn't have voice in shaping the post-Second World War order, right? And then there are also questions about the design of that order itself, that it makes certain assumptions, right, that underpin it, right? And that is linked to the question of the relationship that you mentioned between international law and power. To the extent that international law and power are in sync, we feel that there is respect for international law. where they diverge, all right, it becomes clear that it's not really respect of international law that is at play. It is actually the power interest of countries, right? And this current moment of crisis is the manifestation of these ingrained, structural design flaws, and how the system or the insurance has been operationalized over time.
Let me attempt at disaggregation in order to cut down the very big piece of cake that you lay out in front of me. So I think one start of disaggregation is to separate between the law as an hegemonic construction and the law as a protective instrument. And there are countries that are very powerful, that construct laws to structure their hegemony. And there are other countries that cling to the law because it's the best ticket they have to protect their interests. And when we translate this to the global level, there is, of course, a tension inbuilt in these, where on the one hand, you find powerful countries like Russia, like the United States, and other countries that have never really wanting to submit themselves to the rule of international law, and the United States of America in particular, as the so-called founder of the system of the American century, has been particularly at the forefront of this. Now, the tension between, if we want to keep in this polarity between rule givers and rule takers, is managed through politics within one of the most unique international organizations that we have in the world, which is the United Nations. Because the United Nations is not just the Security Council, and you can have a lot of views on whether it's still operational or not, or the General Assembly. It is ultimately the only institution in the world with nearly universal membership of all states that essentially act as peer pressure mechanisms on state. And what we see currently is that those states who are breaking international law are the most isolated states in the world, which means that the great majority of the UN membership, they still believe in a great majority of the rules that the United Nations is known for. I think there is a lot of anger around the world for the duplicity of many, many countries, including from Europe, including from big powers, that set out laws but then basically don't stick to them when they are themselves involved in war or pressured by war. But one might separate between what are the fundamental principles of humanity expressed in the global system, and the institutionalization of the day-to-day application of these laws. Because what we see very clearly from Geneva, that many Western countries and many countries who have been part of the United Nations system from the beginning play a disproportionate influence in how the organizations are run and how, in fact, the international laws are being executed on a day-by-day. And that is, I think, problematic. So separating between and looking very clearly at the legal acquis that exists, and with respect to what is the institutionalization associated with this, I think that was a very important exercise, particularly for Africa, that has now such a vibrant, not just a vibrant regional agency, to become much more autonomous in its positioning in Africa and the world, but also that has such a new, vibrant think tank culture, which can in fact look at this much more in detail and also then translate it in what this means for policy.
Now, I think the point about multilateralism and its universality, I think one of the criticisms of the existing order is basically that it hasn't really been genuinely global. If you look at just from a geographic perspective, all right, and ask yourself, where are the centers of decision making for this global order? I mean, literally, you will count the cities and the places where these are, located, all right? And you would find that all of them are where? All of them are basically northern-centric, right? And location and positionality matters a great deal in terms of how you look at events in the world, right? And that is why the idea of problematizing the claim of universality becomes critical in a moment like this one, particularly so that you are able to say, okay, there are different manifestations of the crisis that is afflicting the global order, all right? And the reason why it is in this state had also to do with the fact that it was not really fully global, even just from that perspective, all right? So the idea is not to say that, we have to throw the baby with the bathwater. No. It is basically to indicate that there are, concerns about the state of health of the baby itself, and that we need to attend to. That requires that, that attention, right? But that disaggregation that you made, not just in the political realm is one of them, but if you look at it, the global trading rules, the global financial architecture itself, all right? You would find that, and that has created, for example, today, one of the pillars of the UN, which is development, couldn't be meaningfully pursued and realized exactly because of this. The Secretary General, didn't mince his words when he said that the international financial architecture, for example, turned out to be extortionist for particularly the parts of the world in the global south, whether that is in terms of how it has created an environment that puts these countries in, permanent state of heavy indebtedness, thereby, today, for example, many countries on the continent, they pay more for servicing debt and for paying interest on their debt than they invest to achieve the sustainable development goals.
Again, disaggregation is important because I think let's not call of the international orders, but the multitude of orders that exist. And here, particularly with the international economic orders that is associated with the Bretton Woods system, has, of course, a very particular history of American expansionism and American hegemony. And already, I remember when I studied development studies, that was already a very, very, very big topic at 30 years ago. So there is still work to do. But I think disaggregating that system is not necessarily the only system, but there are other systems of international order that are within the UN, within regional organizations.
I think the question really is, indeed there are, but the question is the kind of, how they structure, all right, how the world conducts, how societies go about, engaging in economic, political, and social activities. This economic order, it has heavy consequences and implications. That is why it is really about the extent to which and how far it affects, how people order themselves also,
This is an important perspective on global order. And if we look now, if we transpose this into the current challenge, one discussion that is very prominent in Geneva is about the data colonialism and also the imperialist power of data management systems, which are primarily not driven by state-based interests but by corporate interests. So this is where there is a lot to do for African governments, for African societies, in order to prevent to be yet again into a structural corset that is very difficult to get out to. And this is where, again, the notion of disaggregation is so important, particularly with the emerging think tank culture in Africa. Understanding very clearly what are the factors that shape the problems of moving faster on the achievement of the sustainable development goal. Is it the lacking state-society relationship? Is it the influence of tremendous corporate powers from the outside in? Is it, in fact, the impact of the systemic risks that you have mentioned, from health to climate to chronic violence?
I think fundamentally, the analysis from this part of the world, and many people now, there is data that's widely established, including, for example, by the Catholic Church, Pope, who established a scientific committee that actually released its report just now, all right, about the state of the international economic order, basically saying that is why I actually quoted the Secretary General. That is where actually the fundamental structural issue is. It's not really on this horizontal or on this relationship between state and society. It's not to say that there is no problem here. But if you do not address this one, however good this relationship would be, it wouldn't work. That is, I think, where where this concern comes in, and therefore the call for the reform or overhauling of the system, particularly in the light of where we are today. That brings me to another area of question, which is, in order to address these fractures, these really profound crises that is afflicting the global order. The Secretary General of the UN, for example, advanced certain ideas for reform. And that concept is what is called networked multilateralism, all right? And that is where now, increasingly, if you look at in your area of work, we will come to specific questions, how this crisis is affecting your area of work. But, the new agenda for peace that the Secretary General articulated said that given the crisis that we are facing, particularly in peace and security, regional organizations such as the African Union fill in critical gaps, that is the word he used, fill in critical gaps in the international security architecture. All right? So does this concept of network multilateralism, do you think that it is good enough an answer to the kind of crisis that we are facing? And how do you see it evolving and being given practical realization or practical operation?
I see network multilateralism as a very important new framework, as a new vehicle for accelerated politics to work much faster on the solution of problems. Now, what do I mean by this? If we are looking at the evolution of the problems that many parts of the world have to deal with, problems are developing much, much faster and at much greater scale what the institutions and mechanisms that currently exist can deal with. So we're looking towards a process of breakdown. Now, what do we need to accept? That we need to work differently. The notion of where you have a resolution negotiated over lengthy periods of time in New York, in Geneva, or elsewhere, that is then fed through a state-based implementation mechanisms that takes years, it's not fast enough, and it doesn't produce outcomes at scale. We've seen this particularly with a very, very strong criticism that is being voiced against the COPs, against climate change, which are big meetings, but that are not necessarily producing the responses for climate change that are necessary. So then, building on the conversation we already had, with many of the risk factors, many of the problems that are out there, being beyond the reach of government, being beyond the reach of international organizations currently, there needs to be relationship being built to institutions, to actors, to sometimes individuals that have access to the spaces that are necessary to shift the politics on the issue of specific ecosystems. So let's say, how do we save the Amazon? It's not how we save all rainforests in the world, but let's focus on specific ecosystems. How do we save Russian forests from burning? We are already losing Canadian forests. So all of this requires a new networking, new relationship building, of where UN entities are one part of the role that is necessary to being played. But in order to advance this type of politics, it is necessary to build relationships to different network nodes that represent a specific power to advance the political discussions. And this is the very conceptual foundation of network politics, that you bring together the actors that matter politically to politically solve a problem. Here we are not looking necessarily at technical solutions, of which there has been of course, coming from Geneva, a very strong belief that if you can articulate the best technical solution for something, this is the technical solution that will automatically prevail. This is also a way of working that we see as highly limited, particularly if we are looking at the work of the International Panel on Climate Change, which is some of the best climate science in the world, but whose political embrace has been completely broken down, partly because of the interests of other constituencies that would be very heavily impacted by this. So there needs to be another mechanisms. Why I think this is so important? Because we are currently seeing, particularly in the younger population, a sense of disorientation, a sense of disbelief, that it is in fact possible to do something against this, that the current systems like the UN are no longer valid. And I think here is an important moment where we can say, look, particularly with the young energy that we have, particularly with the energy that we have with some very experienced politicians and very experienced advocates, bring these together in order to create, in fact, spaces, protected spaces, to design new political initiatives and instruments. That is at the heart, for me, of network multilateralism.
Professor Achim, it has been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me. And for those listeners who are interested to learn more about the Geneva political ecosystem that exists, please go to the website of the Geneva Policy Outlook, where you also find articles on the network multilateralism that you authored, Solomon, but also many other issues as they come out of the Geneva ecosystem, which I think are also relevant for the Addis-based ecosystem. So thank you very much for having me.
That is a very important piece of work, which actually brings us also to reflect on the possibility of us even replicating that for the policy environment here in Addis as well. Thank you all very much for joining the Pan-Africanist, Amani Africa's podcast on current and multilateral affairs of concern and interest for Africa and the African Union. We will see you again next time. Thank you again.